You never realize how small acts of disrespect can push someone over the edge until you've lived through it yourself. For me, it started with something as simple as driveway lights. I had spent weeks installing them, choosing a set that would make my home look neat and safe at night. But my peace was shattered when my neighbors, the Karen sisters, decided my driveway was their personal racetrack. Night after night, they would come speeding in and out of their property, their tires cutting across the edge of my driveway. At first I thought it was an accident, but soon I realized they didn't care. Each morning I would wake up to shattered lights, broken glass scattered across the pavement, and deep tire tracks gouged into the soil. I replaced the lights once. They destroyed them within 3 days. I replaced them again, thinking maybe they'd feel guilty. Instead, they laughed. I heard them one night joking loudly about crushing those cheap little garden lights. My blood boiled. The disrespect wasn't just about the lights, it was about me. They thought they could stomp all over my property and walk away without consequences. That's when I decided enough was enough. I wasn't going to argue with them. I wasn't going to beg them to stop. Instead, I invested in something stronger, something they wouldn't see coming. If they wanted to keep running over my lights, then I would make sure those lights could stand up to their recklessness. I replaced the delicate fixtures with industrial-grade driveway lights, the kind built to withstand trucks and heavy machinery. The next time they tried their little stunt, the sisters discovered just how unbreakable my resolve had become. It all began with something so small, something that most people would brush off without a second thought. A set of driveway lights. I had just finished a long month of renovations on the front of my house. It wasn't anything extravagant: fresh gravel for the driveway, a new coat of paint on the porch railing, and the lights. Those lights were the finishing touch, and to me, they mattered more than the paint or the gravel. They lined the edge of the driveway neatly, glowing softly at night, marking the path with a gentle warmth. They made the house look alive, cared for, and safe. I was proud of them. Maybe that pride is why the whole thing stung so deeply when it started. The first time I noticed the damage, it was a Tuesday morning. I stepped outside with a coffee in hand, ready to head to work, and saw the shattered pieces glinting in the morning sun. The glass from one of the lights lay scattered across the edge of the driveway, the casing crushed into the dirt as if a heavy tire had rolled right over it. At first I didn't even consider foul play. I thought maybe a delivery truck had misjudged the angle, or perhaps I had placed the light too close to the edge. I swept up the pieces side and made a mental note to replace it. The replacement came 2 days later. I dug up the broken one, fitted the new one into place, and stood back, satisfied. But 3 nights later, I woke up to the sound of laughter. Outside, high-pitched mocking and too close to ignore. I didn't think much of it at the time, neighbors hosting friends. I assumed. It wasn't until the next morning that I realized the laughter had been at my expense. Another light lay destroyed, glass sparkling across the gravel like cruel confetti. That's when I began to suspect it wasn't an accident. The Karen sisters lived next door. 2 women in their late 30s who carried themselves as though the entire street existed for their amusement. Their names were Bethany and Cheryl, though everyone in the neighborhood just called them the sisters. They were inseparable, loud, and always together, whether it was gardening, gossiping on their porch, or speeding in and out of their shared driveway in their shiny white SUV. They had an energy that demanded attention, but it wasn't the kind of energy that drew admiration. It was the kind that made you grit your teeth. I had noticed before how close their SUV came to the edge of my driveway when they turned in at night. They swung wide, often clipping the border where the lights sat. At first I thought it was carelessness, but after the second smashed light, and then a third one just a week later, it was clear this wasn't coincidence. Each time the damage grew more obvious, and each time I caught the faint sound of their laughter drifting through the night. The sisters weren't subtle. One evening, I stepped out to grab my mail just as they were unloading groceries. Bethany smirked at Cheryl, then looked at me and said, loud enough for me to hear, "Guess we'll see how long those last." They both giggled like schoolgirls sharing a secret. My stomach tightened. They were talking about the lights. I wanted to confront them right then, but I hesitated. Part of me thought maybe I was imagining it, reading too much into their words. Maybe I was paranoid. But then came the night that erased all doubt. It was close to midnight, and I was sitting by the window with a book. Their SUV pulled up, headlights sweeping across my yard. Instead of pulling straight into their driveway, I watched in disbelief as Cheryl deliberately turned the wheel and let the tires roll right across the edge of mine. The crunch was loud this time, loud enough to make me flinch. The sisters burst into laughter before disappearing into their house, leaving me staring at the wreckage of yet another light. That was the moment the anger truly set in. I replaced the lights again, but this time, I did it with a sense of determination. Not because I thought the sisters would suddenly respect my property, but because I wasn't ready to let them win. Each replacement felt like reclaiming a piece of my dignity, a silent refusal to bow down to their petty games. But with each new set, my patience wore thinner. The cost wasn't just in money, it was in the feeling of being mocked, of being pushed into silence. One Saturday afternoon, I finally decided to speak up. The sisters were sitting on their porch, sipping iced tea and gossiping as usual. I walked over calm but firm and said, "Hey, I think your car keeps running over my driveway lights. I'd appreciate it if you could be more careful." They exchanged a look. Bethany smiled sweetly, too sweetly, and said, "Oh, of course, we'll be careful," Cheryl added. "Wouldn't want to ruin your decorations." Their laughter followed me all the way back to my house. That night, another light was crushed. The message was clear. They weren't going to stop it. Became a battle I never signed up for. A war over small fixtures that shouldn't have mattered so much but did, because it wasn't about the lights anymore. It was about respect. About whether I had the right to protect the things I cared about without being ridiculed. Each time I swept up the broken glass, I thought about what it symbolized, and each time I grew more determined not to let them keep winning. I knew then that I couldn't just keep replacing fragile garden lights. If the sisters were intent on destroying them, then I needed to change the game. Something inside me shifted, a spark of defiance I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't going to fight them with words anymore. Words were useless against people who thrived on mockery. No, I was going to fight them with something they couldn't break. And so, with quiet resolve, I began searching for a solution, one they wouldn't see coming. The morning after my failed attempt at reasoning with the sisters, I stood in my driveway staring down at the jagged remnants of another light. The broken glass caught the sunlight in a mocking shimmer, scattered like cruel jewels across the gravel. It wasn't just damage anymore, it was deliberate sabotage. Their smug laughter echoing in my head. My jaw tightened as I swept up the shards, the broom bristling angrily against the stone. They had heard my polite request, smiled in my face, and gone out of their way to crush another light the very same night. That was the day I decided something had to change. No more fragile garden fixtures. No more wasted money on lights that would be broken within a week. If the sisters wanted to play games, I was going to make sure they didn't win. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel powerless. I felt sharp, focused. I spent the next few evenings doing research. My laptop became my weapon as I scoured forums, blogs, and home improvement sites. Most people were content with solar-powered garden stakes, the exact kind I'd been using. They looked nice, sure, but they were flimsy, designed for aesthetic appeal rather than durability. That was fine for most neighborhoods, but not for mine, not with the sisters next door. The breakthrough came when I stumbled upon a contractors forum. Someone had posted about heavy-duty driveway markers used for warehouses, construction zones, and even airport runways. These weren't decorative lights. They were built to withstand trucks rolling over them day and night. Reinforced steel bases, thick LED casings, and impact-resistant designs. They were practically indestructible. My pulse quickened as I scrolled through photos. Sleek, industrial-grade lights glowing brilliantly under the weight of massive machinery. These weren't just lights. They were shields. Of course, they weren't cheap. My first thought was hesitation. I really want to spend that much money just to outsmart a couple of petty neighbors. But then I remembered the smirk on Bethany's face, the mocking tone in Cheryl's voice when she called my lights decorations. The anger came back sharp and hot. Yes, I thought, I wanted this. I needed this. It wasn't just about the lights anymore, it was about proving a point. That night, I placed the order, a full set of industrial-grade driveway lights. Delivery would take a week, and that week felt like the longest of my life. Every day I braced myself for more destruction. Every night I listened for the crunch of tires rolling over my property. And sure enough, the sisters didn't disappoint. By the time the new lights arrived, they had destroyed 2 more of the flimsy ones I'd installed as placeholders. Each broken light only fueled my resolve further. The delivery came on a Saturday morning. The heavy boxes dropped off at my doorstep. Just the weight of them made me smile. This was no fragile glass. This was solid, unyielding. I spent the afternoon unboxing each one, running my hands over the reinforced casings. The steel bases gleamed, strong and unbending, and the LEDs inside were brighter than anything I'd used before. These lights weren't just replacements, they were weapons of silent defiance. Installing them wasn't easy. I dug deeper holes, poured concrete bases, and set each light firmly into place. Sweat dripped down my back as I worked, but with each fixture secured, my determination grew stronger. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, my driveway glowed with a new kind of light, not fragile, not breakable, but steady and strong. I stood at the edge of the gravel, arms crossed, and admired my work. For the first time in weeks I felt victorious, but victory, I knew, would only come when the sisters made their move. Sure enough, the test came sooner than I expected. That same night, close to midnight, I heard the familiar roar of their SUV. I flicked off the lamp in my living room and stood by the window, hidden in the shadows. My heart pounded as their headlights swept across the yard. I could almost predict the way Cheryl would turn the wheel, aiming for the edge of my driveway like it was part of her nightly ritual. And she did. The SUV swerved wide, the tires rolling, toward the line of lights. I braced myself. Instead of the sickening crunch of breaking glass, there was a sharp metallic clang. The SUV jolted, bouncing slightly as the tire met resistance. The light didn't shatter, it didn't bend. It stood firm, glowing steadily beneath the weight of the vehicle. I could hear the sisters' laughter cut off abruptly. The SUV slowed, hesitated, then pulled forward into their driveway. The night air was thick with silence. From my window I saw them climb out of the car and walk over to the light. They bent down, inspecting it. Their silhouettes moved stiffly, no longer carefree. Bethany touched the casing, probably expecting to see cracks, but the light gleamed unbroken beneath her hand. They stood there for a long moment before retreating into their house. No laughter this time, no smug comments, just silence. I stayed at the window long after their porch light clicked off, my chest rising and falling with a mixture of relief and triumph. For the first time I felt the balance of power shift. They had tested me, mocked me, pushed me into silence. But now, finally, I had pushed back in a way they couldn't ignore. The next morning I walked out to check the lights. Not a single scratch. They glowed brightly, proud and defiant. As I stood there, coffee in hand, I noticed the sisters peeking from behind their curtain. When they realized I'd caught them staring, the curtain fell back into place. I smiled. They weren't laughing anymore. It wasn't over, not yet. I knew people like the sisters didn't give up, so they'd find another way to test me, another way to try and assert control. But at least now I had shown them something they hadn't expected, that I wasn't weak. And I wasn't going to let them bully me into submission. And as I looked at those unbreakable lights lining my driveway, I realized something else. This wasn't just about the sisters anymore. This was about me, my home, my pride, my refusal to be disrespected. The lights were more than fixtures now. They were a statement. And for the first time I couldn't wait for the next round. For a few days after the incident with the industrial-grade lights, there was silence. No laughter, no mocking, no crushed glass waiting for me in the morning. The sisters kept to themselves, at least outwardly. I thought, perhaps, I had finally won. Each night, as I sat by the window watching the steady glow of my new lights, I felt a quiet satisfaction. They hadn't been able to break them, and that defeat had silenced them. But silence, I would soon learn, was not the same as surrender. By the end of the week, their behavior started to change. It began subtly at first. Whenever I stepped outside to water the plants or grab the mail, one or both of them would appear on their porch. They didn't say anything, but they would stand there, sipping their iced tea, eyes fixed on me with an unmistakable sharpness. It wasn't the playful cruelty of before. It was something colder, heavier. I could feel their gaze pressing into me as though daring me to acknowledge them. I didn't. I refused to give them that satisfaction. Then came the whispers. One morning as I was leaving for work, I overheard Bethany talking to another neighbor. Her voice carried across the street, pitched just loud enough for me to hear. "He's so obsessive," she said with a dramatic sigh. "All those silly lights. He spends more time fussing over them than actually living. It's honestly a little unwell." The neighbor gave an awkward laugh, clearly unsure whether to agree or stay silent. Bethany thrived in that kind of discomfort, twisting it into validation that wasn't long before Cheryl joined in. At the local grocery store, I caught her in the next aisle, telling someone about how I sat in the dark, spying through the window every night, just to watch my lights. The way she told it, I sounded like a paranoid lunatic, a man obsessed with glowing fixtures. Her audience laughed uncomfortably, but they laughed nonetheless. The gossip spread quickly. That's how the sisters worked. They didn't just confront, they poisoned the air around them, turning neighbors into spectators in their petty drama. Soon, I noticed the sideways glances from people I had once exchanged friendly nods with. It was infuriating. They couldn't break my lights, so now they were trying to break my reputation. I told myself to ignore it, but ignoring only seemed to embolden them. One evening, as I drove home from work, I found their SUV parked halfway across the edge of my driveway. It wasn't blocking me completely, but enough to make pulling in awkward. I honked lightly, expecting them to move it. Instead, Cheryl leaned out the window and shouted, "Careful, don't scratch your precious lights," before driving off, laughter echoing behind her. That night, I felt the familiar anger rising inside me again, but I also felt something new. They wanted me to lash out, to lose my temper in front of the neighbors, to prove their whispers right. But I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. No, if they wanted a war, I would fight it on my terms. Still, their games didn't stop. One afternoon, I came home to find footprints in the flower bed near my driveway. The soil was crushed, stems broken. It was too deliberate to be an accident. Another time, I found fast food wrappers scattered along the edge of my yard, greasy bags tossed carelessly near the lights. It was petty vandalism, yes, but it was also a message. We can touch your property whenever we want. I started documenting everything. Photos of the crushed flowers, the litter, the SUV parked too close. Screenshots of their gossip online because, yes, they had taken their campaign to the neighborhood Facebook group. Bethany had written a post about strange behavior next door, claiming I was obsessed with surveillance and creating an uncomfortable environment. People commented with emojis and polite concern, but I could read between the lines. They were planting seeds. The more they pushed, the more careful I became. Instead of retaliating, I doubled down on my routine. Every evening I checked the lights, making sure they were spotless and glowing bright. I kept my yard tidy, my house immaculate. If they wanted to paint me as obsessive, I would be meticulous. If they wanted me to crack, I would be unbreakable. But even with my patience, I couldn't ignore the tension building inside me. Each time I caught their smug glances, each time I overheard their venomous words, I felt the same heat crawl up my spine. They had tried to break my lights. Now they were trying to break me. And somewhere deep down I knew they wouldn't stop until they found a way to make me snap. The turning point came one Saturday evening. I was out front, trimming the hedge, when I noticed the sisters on their porch again. They weren't whispering. This time, they were loud, animated, their voices carrying easily across the space between our houses. Honestly, Bethany said, shaking her head dramatically, who even needs that many lights? It's like living next to an airport runway. Cheryl laughed. At least if a plane crashes, it'll know where to land. They burst into laughter, clinking their glasses together like it was some kind of performance, and maybe they knew I could hear every word. Maybe they wanted me to. I gripped the hedge trimmers tightly, forcing myself to keep working. My pulse was racing, my jaw clenched so hard it ached. For a moment, I imagined walking over there, throwing their words back in their faces, telling them exactly what I thought of their cruelty. But I didn't. Instead, I trimmed the last branch, gathered the clippings, and carried them inside. That night, as I sat by the window watching my unbreakable lights glow steadily against the darkness, I made a promise to myself. This wasn't just about standing my ground anymore. This was about strategy. The sisters thought they could control the narrative. But I knew something they didn't. Patience was its own kind of weapon. Let them talk, let them laugh. The lights still stood, glowing stronger than ever. And soon enough, I would show them that my resolve was every bit as unbreakable. The silence of defiance couldn't last forever. The sisters had mocked me with their words, tried to humiliate me with gossip, and vandalized the edges of my property with their petty little stunts. But even all of that seemed like child's play compared to what they pulled next. It was late on a Thursday evening. I had just returned home from work, exhausted but ready for the simple comfort of sitting by the window with a cup of tea, watching my unbreakable lights glow against the gathering dark. I turned into my driveway, only to slam on the brakes. My heart pounded as I stared at the sight before me. Their SUV parked directly across my driveway, blocking the entrance entirely. The headlights were off, but the engine was still running. Bethany sat in the driver's seat, her sunglasses perched on her head despite the fading daylight. Cheryl lounged in the passenger seat, sipping from a soda cup. They didn't move. They didn't even pretend it was an accident. Instead, they stared at me, smug smiles plastered across their faces, daring me to react. I rolled down my window. "You're blocking my driveway," I called out, keeping my voice level. Bethany shrugged. "Oh, sorry," she said, though her tone carried not a shred of apology. "Didn't realize your little lights needed a clear runway." Cheryl giggled. "Maybe if you flash them, planes will land here to rescue you." The laughter rang out again, sharp and cruel. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. For weeks, I had endured their taunts, their petty sabotage, their slander around the neighborhood. But this was no longer background noise. This was a deliberate blockade, a violation of my space, a challenge I could no longer ignore. I pulled my car over to the side of the road and got out. "Move your vehicle," I said firmly. My voice didn't rise, but it carried a weight that surprised even me. Bethany raised an eyebrow. "What?" she asked, her smile widening. Cheryl leaned out of the window, smirking. "You gonna call the light police?" Their mockery washed over me, but this time I didn't flinch. Instead, I pulled my phone from my pocket and began recording. I held it steady, aiming it right at their smug faces. "You're trespassing," I said calmly, "and you're blocking access to my property. If you don't move your car, this video goes straight to the police." The laughter faltered just slightly. Bethany's smile twitched, though she tried to keep it plastered on. "Oh, come on," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Don't be so dramatic." "Move the car," I repeated, my tone sharper now. For a moment, no one moved. Then Cheryl huffed, muttering something under her breath, and Bethany finally shifted the SUV into reverse. They backed up just enough to clear my driveway, but not without rolling over the edge where my light stood. The SUV's tires bumped against one of the fixtures with a metallic clang, but, as always, the light stood unbroken. I smiled faintly as the sound echoed in the night. I pulled into my driveway slowly, deliberately, letting my headlights sweep across their unimpressed faces. When I stepped out of my car, they were still sitting there, watching me. "You really think you've won, don't you?" Bethany called out, her voice colder now, stripped of its mocking playfulness. I turned to face them. "I don't need to win," I said. "I just need you to stop." Cheryl laughed again, but it was hollow, forced. "We don't stop," she said, and then, just like that, they drove off into the night, their laughter trailing behind them like a bad omen. I stood in my driveway long after their taillights disappeared, my pulse pounding in my ears. The confrontation had ended, but I knew it wasn't over. If anything, it had only escalated. They had been embarrassed by my refusal to bend, by my decision to film them. People like the sisters didn't forgive embarrassment easily. They would come back harder. And they did. 2 nights later I was woken by a strange noise outside, a low scraping sound, followed by muffled laughter. My stomach tightened as I slipped quietly out of bed and pulled the curtain back just enough to peek through. There they were. The sisters crouched near my driveway, holding something in their hands. A bucket. My eyes widened as Cheryl dipped a brush into the bucket and began smearing something dark and sticky across the pavement near my lights. Bethany giggled as she added her own strokes. The two of them working quickly in the glow of the street lamp. Graffiti. They were painting graffiti across my driveway. My first instinct was to run out there, to confront them, to shout until they dropped their brushes and fled. But then I noticed something important. The phone still on my nightstand. I grabbed it, hit record, and captured every second from my window. Their laughter, their whispers, the gleam of paint splattering across the ground, it was all there. Evidence. When they finally stumbled back toward their SUV, leaving behind a mess of ugly black streaks across my driveway, I felt a surge of triumph. They thought they were humiliating me, but in reality, they had just handed me the proof I needed. The next morning, I didn't clean up the graffiti. Instead, I took photos from every angle. I called the police, filed a report, and handed over the video. For the first time, the law was on my side. The officers assured me they would have a talk with the sisters, and while I doubted a lecture would change their behavior, the knowledge that they could no longer deny their actions was satisfying. When the officers left, I noticed the sisters watching from their porch, their faces pale and tight. No laughter this time, no smug smiles, just silence. That evening, as I scrubbed the paint from my driveway, I couldn't help but feel the shift in the air. The balance of power was no longer tilted in their favor. They had tried to break me, but in their arrogance they had crossed a line, and now, for the first time, they were the ones on the defensive. The war wasn't over, but the battle had turned. The days following the graffiti incident were strangely quiet. The Karen sisters, who once seemed to thrive on making themselves the center of attention, were suddenly subdued. Their porch, once a stage for gossip, laughter, and taunt, sat empty. Their SUV, which used to roar in and out of their driveway at all hours, now remained parked for long stretches of time. It was as if the weight of that police visit had pressed down on them, draining away their confidence. At first I didn't trust the silence. I kept waiting for the next shoe to drop, for the next prank or escalation, for the next moment of pettiness, aimed squarely at me. But days passed. Then a week, then 2. My driveway lights stood unbroken, glowing steadily each night like watchful sentinels. My yard remained untouched. No crushed flowers, no trash tossed into the grass, no SUV parked across my entrance. It was as if the sisters had finally realized their antics had consequences, but I knew people like them didn't. Surrender eyes. They didn't just change overnight. Their pride was too sharp, their egos too fragile. It wasn't enough that they stopped. I needed closure. I needed to know that the war they had dragged me into was truly over. That closure came unexpectedly. On a warm Saturday morning, I was sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee when a knock echoed from my gate. It was Mr. Alvarez, one of my quieter neighbors, a man who usually kept to himself. He looked hesitant, shifting uncomfortably as he approached. "I thought you should know," he said, lowering his voice. "The sisters, they've been talking about moving." I blinked, caught off guard. "Moving?" He nodded. "Word is, they're tired of all the drama, tired of being watched, tired of the reputation they've built. They don't like how the neighborhood sees them now. They're embarrassed." Embarrassed. That word hung in the air like a victory flag. For weeks they had tried to embarrass me, twisting the story to make me look like the obsessive neighbor. They had laughed at me, mocked me, destroyed my property, even tried to smear my name. And yet, in the end, it was they who couldn't handle the consequences. That afternoon, I confirmed it myself. I saw the sisters standing in their yard, talking to a realtor. Their voices were low, their expressions tight. There was no trace of the smug confidence they once carried. For the first time since they'd entered my life, they looked small. I didn't gloat. I didn't shout or taunt or even wave. I simply stood by my glowing lights and watched them. They glanced my way once, and I thought I saw a flicker of something pass across Bethany's face, in guard maybe, or shame. Cheryl quickly looked away. In the following weeks the for sale sign went up. Cars came and went, prospective buyers walking through their home. The sisters stayed indoors most of the time, their porch silent, their SUV rarely moving. They avoided me entirely, as if even eye contact might crack the brittle wall of dignity they were trying to hold on to. The day they finally moved out, I stood at my window, coffee in hand, and watched. The SUV was packed with boxes, its back sagging under the weight. They made no grand exit, no final performance. They simply drove off, their laughter absent, their windows rolled up tight, and then they were gone. That night, I stepped out into my driveway. The air felt lighter somehow, the silence less oppressive. The lights glowed steadily, brighter than ever, their reflections shimmering across the gravel. For the first time in months, I felt peace. I thought back to the beginning, to that first shattered light. to the laughter in the darkness, to the anger that had burned in my chest each time I swept up broken glass. What had started as something so small, so petty, had turned into a war. And yet, through it all, I had learned something about myself. The sisters had tried to bully me into silence, but I had refused. They had tried to break me, but I had grown stronger. The lights weren't just fixtures anymore, they were a symbol of resilience, of standing firm when pushed, of refusing to let disrespect take root in your own home. And now, as I stood there with the glow of victory lighting up my driveway, I realized something else. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't a dramatic confrontation or a shouted argument. Sometimes, the best revenge is simply outlasting your enemies. The sisters were gone. My home was intact, my lights still stood, and in the quiet of that evening, with nothing but the steady glow of unbreakable bulbs to keep me company, I finally let myself smile. The war was over, and I had won.